All right, good evening everyone, and welcome to Mary Meyer Cook Athenaeum. My name is Bruno Yoon, and I'm one of the Athenaeum Fellows this year. I know this talks about California, but I feel like everyone's had this experience. It's election time, and you're staring at your ballot at a section where you don't even recognize the names, let alone who to vote for. Maybe it's state Supreme Court judges, or community college districts, or hospital districts, and city council. Well, that's the case for a lot of people for California's ballot propositions. They're just a bunch of numbers. What do they even mean? Here to enlighten us a bit tonight, with the help of my friends at the Rose Institute of State and Local Government and its video voter series, are Bob Stern and Ken Miller. Bob Stern's the co-founder and former president of the Center for Governmental Studies, which is a California think tank that focuses on political reform. He began drafting and analyzing political reform laws as a staff attorney for the California Legislature's Assembly Elections Committee. He then served as the Elections Counsel to the California Secretary of State's office. He's drafted numerous state initiatives. He was a principal drafter of the City of Los Angeles' Ethics and Public Campaign Financing laws in 1990. Stern is a graduate of Pomona College and of Stanford Law. And Ken Miller, our very own Ken Miller, he's a professor of government right here at CMC. He's the associate director of the Rose Institute. His research focuses on state government institutions with emphasis on direct democracy, things like initiatives, referenda, and recall elections. So before we begin, a couple of pointers. By the way, while you weren't paying attention, voters passed a ballot proposition in the primary back in June called Proposition 73, not to be confused with the one in 2005 that would have required parental notifications for abortion. You saw it on your ballots, Californians. Maybe you just don't remember. Well, we at the AF has more resources than you might realize. We got that on the ballot. We got all the signatures. We hired all the lawyers to make sure the language was up to code. And this Prop 73 passed 65 to 35, pretty wide margin. Well, what does Prop 73 do? It bans cell phone usage as well as audio and visual recording in the Athenaeum during dinners and talks. Don't ask me how we managed to get that into acceptable statutory language. I got to talk to the lawyers on that one. But my point is, under the California state constitution, it is now illegal to record these talks audio or visually, or to use your cell phone. So silence it and put it away. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bob Stern and Ken Miller.
All right, well, thank you, Bruno. As we were saying, we were trying to rack our brains. What was Prop 73? I can't remember, right? So I just want to thank you all for being here tonight, and also for my friend Bob. This is the third election cycle where he has worked with the Rose Institute and CMC on ballot measures. So it's been sort of a two-step process each time. We put together video voter project, and Bob works with the students in helping them with the research and then putting together these backgrounders, which you have before you on your table, and then that's converted into scripts, which are then used to as the basis for these videos the students prepare. And we think that it's been one of the best projects for the Rose Institute over these past several years. Really high quality product and also a great learning experience for the students. And it's also provides some nice education for voters out there. They get views out on the internet, and we get really good feedback from folks out in the community that it's a good resource. Before we go on, I just want to recognize the students who participated on the Video Voter Project this year. Will Frankel was the student manager of that project. Nassim Nazari, Ben McAnally, Zach Wong, Bryn Miller, Alec Lapata, and Malia Wong. So those of you who are here tonight, I'd like you to stand up and be recognized by the crowd. We're going to show a couple of the videos tonight. Actually, Zach and Malia are going to be featured. Zach actually twice. I'm not sure how that worked out. It just happened to be the measures that we decided we wanted to focus on in our talk tonight. But I do encourage those of you who have not yet checked out these videos to go onto the Rose Institute website or just Google Rose Institute Video Voter, and you can have a chance to watch these. Before I move on from thanks, I also want to thank Bapasha Nadon, who's over there on the side. She did fantastic work working with this project and has for the last couple of years. So. All right, so I thought we'd begin. Bob and I talked a little bit about what we'd like to do tonight. We're going to talk about a few of the measures, but before we do that, we thought it might be good just to give a little bit of context about the ballot process and how it's some of the distinctive things this year about what's on the ballot, measures that have been put on by the legislature as well as by citizens, and what's the difference between those, and just sort of like a broad overview of this year's ballot. So, Bob, you want to do that?
I also want to thank Ken and the students. I'm always impressed with the students and their videos. I want to thank the students very much for what they did this year. It was just a terrific experience working with them. I teach at UCLA Extension 115 adults. They take the class, they don't have any papers, they don't have any tests, I don't give them any grades, and they don't get any credit. So it's a great class. I'm sure all the students here would love to have a class like that with no papers and no tests, but you'd want the credit. But when I start out, I say, you know, we always hear about bad news. So I always, every week that I'm teaching the class called the November election, I say, there is good news. And I wanted to sort of pass on some good news to you first before we got into the initiative process. The good news is, for those of you who are here, that first of all, if you're seniors, you're likely to get a job in June because the economy is really doing very well. Secondly, the Rams are undefeated. And the Chargers, the other football team in town, are 6-2, and one of the games they lost to was to the Rams, so they're doing very well too. And of course, the Dodgers were in the World Series. They lost, but they were in the World Series, and of course, Ken timed it exactly right so the Dodgers wouldn't be playing tonight, unfortunately.
We were actually concerned about
and then,
competition with the World Series tonight. But.
And then a note for you who suffer stress. If you suffer stress, use lavender. Studies have shown that lavender oil used in aromatherapy can help relieve stress, relax the body, and promote better sleep. So go out and get your lavender. And finally, the election is only 1 week away. That's good news for us. The bad news is the day after the election, we'll be talking about 2020 and who's going to be running for president. But the other good news is there's lots of information about this election, and particularly these videos by the students. 8 of the measures, 11 measures on the ballot are initiatives. 3 are put on by the legislature. This year, we have 11 measures. 2 years ago, we had 18. So if you're a voter, be thankful for the fact that you don't have as many. And 2 years ago, the measures were really much more controversial. We had measures dealing with drug prices, with marijuana legalization, with condoms for porn stars, with for drug prices, and so on. So there are fewer this year. And also for the first time this year, 4 were taken off the ballot. So we should have had 15 on the ballot, but we only have 11. Why is that? 3 measures were taken off the ballot because the legislature started considering them and passed some bills, and the initiative proponents said, okay, we will take off the soda tax initiative, we will take off a privacy initiative because the legislature passed those bills, and also the lead paint manufacturers took off their initiative. And then there was another initiative taken off the ballot by the California Supreme Court, and I was very upset about that because that was my favorite initiative. That was the one that
vote for that one.
That was the one that divided the state into 3 parts. So it would be 3 Californians. We'd have 6 senators instead of 2 senators, and it would have been a great discussion here tonight, but that was taken off the ballot. So be happy about that. Now, why do we have the initiative process? Well, first of all, the reason is because the legislature doesn't act on something, then California and 24 other states can circulate initiatives and put it on the ballot. The other thing, though, that came out in my class last week, they said, you know, if we didn't have the initiative process, if we didn't have the ballot measure process, we wouldn't be discussing rent control. We wouldn't be discussing, voters wouldn't be discussing the gas tax. We wouldn't be discussing animals and animal cruelty and so forth. So the initiative encourages all of us to get involved and to discuss those things. Now, initiatives, 2/3 of initiatives go down, are defeated. So that's why it's easy to get something on the ballot. If you have enough money, if you have $3 million, you can get almost anything on the ballot, but passing it is something else again. So with that, why don't we start looking at some of these initiatives and measures?
Yeah, so again, there are 11 of them, and we're going to start with the one that's perhaps received the most attention. This is Proposition 6, and just a little lead up to it, and then we'll show the video. This is a measure that was put on the ballot by Republicans, basically. It was funded by the California Republican Party and actually national Republicans. Paul Ryan put money into this. The California state legislature passed and Jerry Brown signed a substantial increase in the gas tax, a 12-cent a gallon increase in the gas tax, plus there are additional taxes and fees that were part of that legislative package. New taxes on diesel fuels, new higher vehicle license fee, and things like that. And so this is a conservative, basically, reaction or response to that, to essentially repeal the gas tax. And there's an additional provision in this bill that would require voter approval for future such taxes. So why don't we run this video? This is Zach's account of Proposition 6.
Hi, my name is Zach Wong. I'm a student at Claremont McKenna College. I will be discussing Proposition 6, the initiative that would repeal a recent increase in the state's gas tax and require voter approval for future gasoline-related taxes. Gasoline sold in California is subject to state and federal taxes, most of which are used to pay for road maintenance and improvement. The federal government charges 18.4 cents per gallon. The state charges more than 55 cents per gallon through a mix of excise and sales taxes. California's gas taxes are the second highest in the nation, with only Pennsylvania higher. Aside from taxes, Californians currently pay about 67 cents per gallon more than the national average for regular unleaded gasoline, mainly due to the higher cost of refining gasoline in the state. California's gas taxes reached their current level in 2017, when Governor Jerry Brown signed Senate Bill 1. This law raised the state gas tax by 12 cents per gallon from 18 cents to 30 cents, and also increased taxes on diesel fuel. SB 1 also imposed a new vehicle registration fee ranging from $25 to $175 based on a car's value, and an annual $100 fee on zero-emission vehicles. The new taxes are indexed for inflation in the future. 2/3 of SB 1's revenue are allocated to road construction and repair, with the remainder going to other projects such as mass transit. Proposition 6 would repeal all of SB 1's tax and fee increases and require voter approval for any future increases of this type. The legislative analyst estimates that Proposition 6 would reduce state revenues by $5.1 billion annually. Proposition 6 is backed by a coalition including the California Republican Party, the National Federation of Independent Business, and taxpayer advocacy groups such as the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association and Americans for Tax Reform. They say that new gas taxes place a burden on Californians who already have some of the highest living costs in the country. They also say that road maintenance and repair can be paid for by existing funds. Proposition 6 is opposed by a coalition including the California Democratic Party, the League of California Cities, the California Chamber of Commerce, and construction labor unions. They argue that the revenues generated by SB 1 are needed to complete critical and long-delayed transportation projects. Prop 6, they say, would further degrade the state's road conditions, risking public safety and increasing costs in the long term. In summary, a yes vote on Proposition 6 would repeal the state's recent gas tax increases and require voter approval for any future increases to gasoline and related taxes. A no vote on Proposition 6 would keep the state's current gas taxes in effect and reject the requirement for future voter approval for such taxes. For more information on Prop 6, visit roseinstitute.org and these other sites.
All right, round of applause for Zach. Nice job. So, Bob, what's your view of this, both maybe on the merits, and then also what do you think is going to happen on Election Day?
Well, first of all, this should have been a referendum. We have a referendum system in California where you can challenge legislative bills through the ballot signature process. The problem is it would have given them 90 days to circulate this, and that was a very short period of time, whereas they took 180 days to circulate the initiative. But I would much rather be on the no side than the yes side, since whenever there is a controversy over a ballot measure, people tend to vote no. And what's happening on this measure is you have the Chamber of Commerce and the labor groups opposed to this. You have the Democratic Party opposed to it. You have the LA Times opposed to it. You have the broad, and they've raised, I think, $40 to $50 million to oppose this. Jerry Brown is also obviously opposed to it. And the Republicans who put this on the ballot to help their congressional candidates have not put any money in it to support it. However, and Ken and I were talking about this, if you read the summary by the Attorney General on your ballot, I think, and frankly, I am against this proposition, but I think what the Attorney General did was misleading. And let me just read it to you, because it should have read, in my mind, repeals the gas tax. But he says, eliminates certain road repair and transportation funding, requires certain fuel taxes and vehicle fees be approved by the electorate, repeals the 2017 transportation law taxes and fees designated for road and public transportation. I think this is going to be a much closer election than people might think. The latest polls show it getting about 41% yes, meaning repealing the gas tax, and about 49% no. Probably will go down, but we just don't, depends on who votes and also whether people want to repeal the tax or not.
Yes, so I'll just add a little bit of extra context, which is, as Zach said in the video, California has currently, with this new law that was adopted by the legislature, the second highest gas tax in the nation. It's, if you put together federal taxes plus state taxes, it's a 74-cent per gallon tax. Every gallon of gas is 74 cents. Pennsylvania has the highest at 77, but there are a lot of states that are considerably lower. So you go next door to Arizona, it's about 40 cents or less per gallon as opposed to close to 80. So it's a different level of taxation that we have on top of very high gas prices. So there's separate reasons for that, partly because of our environmental regulations. It costs more to refine gasoline in California. So California has one of the highest gas taxes in the country, plus gas prices total. So should this be a matter of concern, right? Is this actually, some people might say, this is actually a good thing. Why might this be a good thing for gasoline prices to be high? And some people might say, well, because it encourages, incentivizes people to go buy hybrids or plug-in vehicles and not buy SUVs or pickup trucks or things like that that cost a lot to fill up a tank of gas, right? So if that's your orientation, then that makes some sense. This might actually be a positive good that we have to pay more for gasoline and incentivizes people to get fuel-efficient vehicles. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who can't necessarily go out there and buy a fairly high-priced hybrid or plug-in vehicle. They've got an older vehicle, and they may, sort of the working class or working poor people are the people overall, this is just one little piece of it, but the people overall who are being really squeezed in this state. And if you think about it, a gasoline tax is a highly regressive tax. Everybody pays the same amount, whether you're a billionaire or whether you're trying to get by on $30,000 or $40,000 a year, right? So this is a complicated social question, really. Where should we get our taxes? Where should we get revenue from? Obviously, we need to fill potholes in our roads and do a better job of that, and road maintenance and such. But a good argument can be made, I think, that we should really be careful about continuing to raise taxes, especially on people who have the least ability to afford it.
I guess the 12 cents, I mean, I filled up my gas tank this morning, and the gas prices were down 4 cents. And so they go up and down by much more than 12 cents. I think 12 cents really is it doesn't encourage people to buy electric cars. The big problem is, we came from Malibu today on PCH. Now, PCH you might think is Pacific Coast Highway. It really is not Pacific Coast Highway. It's Prius Coast Highway, because there's so many Priuses on the road there. And what's happening is, because we own a Prius, we're getting over 50 miles to the gallon. Previous car I had got 25 miles to the gallon. So you need to have a higher gas tax, because we're getting so much better mileage in order to repair the roads. And what this does is, it's $5 billion. This could be up to $5 billion in terms of road repair and mass transit. This does not apply to the bullet train. None of this money goes to the bullet train, but it does go to repairing roads, freeways, and also mass transit projects.
Okay, so I recognize there are a lot of Prius drivers on the west side of LA. If you go to Bakersfield or Fresno, there are a lot of people driving pickup trucks, right? And so those are the people who are getting squeezed.
And they're getting better mileage as years go by too.
All right.
Yeah.
So if they're able to update their car, I mean, a lot of people drive 10-year-old cars or 15-year-old cars, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, this is a bigger issue for California. We can talk about it in the context of this particular tax, but I think just the cost of living in general in this state is causing a lot of people to exit California or consider exiting California. People on the high end of the income scale can pay a premium to live here, right? They're able to afford high gas taxes, high income taxes, high sales taxes. You go across the board. But if you are a working class person, it's becoming more and more difficult. And I think the policymakers just don't take that fully into consideration.
Well, I think what they're looking at are the potholes that we're hitting and how much money it's costing us to repair our cars because our roads aren't being repaired. So I think it's very important to repair the roads and make sure that we don't have to pay all these repair bills.
Okay, fair enough. Let's move on to the second one in line. This is Malia's video about farm animals.
Hi, my name is Malia Wong. I'm a student at Claremont McKenna College. I'll be discussing Proposition 12, an initiative to impose new requirements on farmers to provide more space for farm animals. 10 years ago, California voters passed Proposition 2, an animal rights measure that limited the ways the state's farmers could confine pregnant pigs, veal calves, and egg-laying hens. Prop 2's requirements were vague and led to battles over interpretation and compliance with the law. For example, although the state's large egg industry has invested millions of dollars to change its operations, it has not gone completely cage-free. California egg farmers have also argued that Prop 2 put them at a competitive disadvantage with out-of-state producers, and they convinced the legislature to pass a law imposing California's standards on eggs sold in the state, regardless of origin, a move that several states have challenged as unconstitutional. Prop 12 would strengthen Prop 2 by phasing out all cages for egg-laying hens and establishing new specific minimum space requirements for breeding pigs and veal calves. Prop 12 would also require compliance by out-of-state producers who sell eggs, veal, or pork products in California. The legislative analyst estimates that Prop 12 would likely increase consumer costs as the farm industry adapts to new requirements. The measure would also increase the state's costs for enforcement by up to $10 million per year. Prop 12 is backed by the Humane Society of the United States, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, Animal Equality, and some other animal rights advocacy groups. They say the measure is needed to clarify and strengthen California's farm animal protections. Opponents include egg farmers, pork producers, and other industry groups. They argue that Prop 12's new restrictions would increase consumer prices and produce shortages. Prop 12 is also opposed by some animal rights organizations, including the Humane Farming Association and People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, PETA, which argue the measure doesn't go far enough in protecting animals. In summary, a yes vote on Prop 12 would require new minimum standards on farmers to provide more space for hens, breeding pigs, and veal calves, and would ban the sale of eggs, pork, or veal from animals housed in ways that did not meet these requirements. A no vote on Proposition 12 would maintain the current limits on confining these farm animals. For more information on Prop 12, visit roseinstitute.org and these other sites.
Terrific job by Malia on that one. So Bob, what's your take on Prop 12?
Well, it's always hard to vote against animals, and there's not much money being spent against this. There are a few ads I've seen against it, but very, very few. The opponents have a website, Stop the Rotten Egg Initiative. And the most interesting part of this is the fact that PETA is against this. And that's surprising to a lot of people. Why would PETA be against it? Well, they say it's because they want to have, this proposition doesn't go far enough. I've also heard that they've said, well, if this passes, people will feel better about eating chickens and pigs because they're in better conditions, and we don't want them eating animals at all, and so we don't want this to pass. That's what I'm also hearing. But I expect this will pass. The LA Times endorses it. The Democratic Party endorses it. The Republican Party is against it. And as they say, without much money being spent against it, I think people are going to say, let's vote for the animals.
Yeah, I think that's a good bet on that one. It's, you vote for the chicken or the pig or something like that.
Yep.
You don't want them to be in a unpleasant environments. There's always a counter argument to these topics, right? And so what would the counter argument be? One was it's going to raise prices, it increases regulation, it makes it more difficult for farmers to do business in the state. It also creates an interesting constitutional question, a federalism issue, because California is not only placing restrictions on its own farmers, but it's putting a restriction on eggs and other products that are raised in other states and saying that they cannot be sold in California unless they meet California requirements. That raises questions about a restriction on interstate commerce and such. And there's actually been litigation already under the previous law. This is the second pass at this issue. California voters adopted a comparable issue or a measure
about 10 years ago.
About 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And there's been compliance, and there's been lawsuits about that an earlier initiative. There was some vagueness in the standards that were set in that earlier measure. This is sort of a second pass at it to kind of clarify and strengthen the standards, essentially.
And
right?
also, this measure never went to the legislature first, except after it qualified. Many propositions, they would go to the legislature and say, okay, why don't you pass something? Well, the Humane Society said, we're just going to ram through this initiative, and they really didn't deal with the legislature in the legislative process much. So this is an initiative you might say, well, maybe the legislature should have tried to deal with this issue before going the initiative route.
Yeah, there are a few of those on this ballot, I think, that really could have been dealt with in an ideal world through the legislative process and wouldn't have to go through the voters. One other thing I would highlight, this is another example, I think, of California sort of asserting a progressive viewpoint and imposing it basically on the rest of the country, trying to leverage its public policy in a way that affects public policy in other states as well. That's a hallmark of California. It has been for a long time, and things like air quality and other issues. And this is an example of it, that California, partly because it's so large, it has such a large market, that producers in every other state, they're not going to want to not be able to sell in the California market. So we have the ability to make a decision on this issue that will have national consequences.
I guess I'm surprised, Ken, are you surprised that not much money is being spent against it?
Yeah, I am surprised. And I can't understand why farmers and others would not fight this one. I mean, you compare this to the dialysis one that we're not going to show a video about, but you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the dialysis Prop 8, you're seeing all the ads on Prop 8, basically labor unions versus dialysis companies. The dialysis companies are spending $100 million against that, showing how much money they have. And the labor unions are saying, we're making them spend all their money. And it's kind of a bad use of the initiative process to have labor say, okay, we want you to spend lots of money against this. And again, that one didn't go to the legislature either. So that's the big one in terms of money, but it really doesn't affect, I mean, obviously if you have kidney problems, it really affects you, but it doesn't affect a whole bunch of us.
Yeah, so the progressives created the system back 100 years ago or so. And the idea was it gave citizens the ability to sort of make public policy when the legislature failed to act, right? And it had this sort of platonic ideal of the citizen lawmaker circulating petitions and then voting on things. In reality, actually pretty early on, and certainly today, it's a lot of interest group activity, right? So you'll have one interest group going after another and sucking $100 million out of this one industry, or you get a lot of that kind of thing. There are other ways that people use this process for particular ends. Sometimes candidates will want to run for office and have a particular issue on the ballot be their platform, right? This is not the case this time. Actually, Gavin Newsom in 2016 had some issues that he was promoting, I think gun control and some other, right? And so it was, when he was still, I think, trying to establish himself in his run for governor, I don't think he felt like he needed to do that this time around. But that's a very common thing. Arnold Schwarzenegger did that with after-school programs and such. So this process has a lot of different uses and purposes.
I worked for Jerry Brown when he was Secretary of State, and he used the Political Reform Act, which was an ethics, campaign financing, and lobbying disclosure initiative, which I helped draft as a campaign tool to run for governor. So, I mean, in a sense, he was one of the first ones to do that. He was successful, but most politicians are not successful using initiatives to promote themselves.
And I think you also mentioned that one of the reasons for the gas tax repeal being on the ballot is that there was a belief among congressional Republicans that if this were on the ballot, it would generate more conservative or Republican turnout, because there is no Republican on the ballot for US Senate, right? And the Republican candidate for governor has basically no chance against Gavin Newsom. So the concern was that a lot of Republicans would just stay home on election day. And this was, the idea was if you put something on the ballot where you could cut taxes, that would generate Republican or conservative turnout. Turns out maybe not so much, because there haven't been much spending on this measure.
Well, we'll see in the congressional districts in Orange County.
Right. Okay, good. You want to do the third one? That's the rent control initiative, Proposition 10.
Hi, my name is Zach Wong. I'm a senior at Claremont McKenna College. I will be discussing Proposition 10, an initiative to lift some state restrictions on rent control policies. Housing in California is incredibly expensive. Today, renters in California typically pay at least 50% more than renters in other states. And in some parts of the state, rents are more than twice the national average. Rent control laws are designed to make rental housing more affordable, but economists debate their overall costs and benefits. For many years, a number of California cities, including Los Angeles, San Francisco, Santa Monica, and Berkeley, have maintained rent control laws. In 1995, the legislature enacted the Costa-Hawkins Act, which limited the scope of these types of laws. This act declared that local governments cannot impose rent control on single-family homes, impose rent control on housing built on or after February 1st, 1995, and impose limits on what a renter pays when first moving in. Proposition 10 would repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act and allow local governments to implement rent control policies without these restrictions. Prop 10 also codifies state court decisions that landlords are entitled to a fair rate of return. The legislative analyst says that the Prop 10 effect on state and local finances will depend on how many jurisdictions enact new rent control laws. If few do, the effects will be minimal. But if many do, these governments could lose tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue each year, primarily due to decreased property and income taxes. The analyst also says that these losses could be partially offset by increasing sales taxes if renters use some of their savings to purchase other goods. Proposition 10 is backed by groups including the Coalition for Affordable Housing and the California Democratic Party, with major funding from the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Supporters of Proposition 10 argue that repealing Costa-Hawkins would give local governments the power to address the housing crisis as they deem best, and that expanding rent control would help many Californians afford a decent place to live. Proposition 10 is opposed by groups, including the California Apartment Association, the California Rental Housing Association, and the California Republican Party, with major funding from individual owners of real estate firms. Opponents argue that rent control policies would discourage future investment in the construction of rental housing and lead to even greater shortages in rental housing, increasing rent prices for those not covered by rent control policies. In summary, a yes vote on Proposition 10 would eliminate several state restrictions on rent control policies. A no vote on Proposition 10 would maintain these restrictions. For more information on Prop 10, visit roseinstitute.org and these other sites.
Zach again, very good. Okay, so Bob, I know you and I kind of disagree on this one, so why don't you take your best shot at why this is a good idea.
Well, I think it's a very good idea, although I have to say, to start off with, it's going to underscore what I said before, that when lots of money is spent against a proposition, the proposition is likely to be defeated. And I do expect this to be defeated because there's so much money being spent against it. But this is a very simple proposition, and conservatives, I think, should be voting yes on this because it gives local control. It says the state won't control what cities and counties do. All this does is repeal a Costa-Hawkins law which says you can't have rent control on single-family houses and on buildings built after 1995. That's all it does. It repeals that. It also says, by the way, you have to give the owners of the property a fair return. So it's a very simple proposition, and then it's up to the cities and counties to decide whether they want rent control or not. So you would expect Santa Monica probably would change their law, San Francisco, LA, but Bakersfield, Fresno probably won't. So it really depends on the local communities. So I think this is a proposition that is very simple, gives local control to people, and allows them to impose rent control on in their jurisdictions. You know, the amazing thing to me is that more than half of renters now spend more than 30% of their income on rents. And more than half, more than 30%, and that's the threshold where you shouldn't be spending more than 30% on rents. 19 jurisdictions now have rent control, but it's very limited by Costa-Hawkins. So I think this is a good proposition that should be passed, but it won't be.
So I'll begin by agreeing that rents are too high in California.
Too damn high, actually.
They're too damn high, right? Indeed they are. And it goes again to this point that I'm making that the people are getting squeezed in this state financially. And Bob had the good news for you that for you seniors that there's a pretty good economy out there. You're likely to get jobs. But if you are going to, you know, the major cities in this state, to Los Angeles, San Francisco, you're going to be paying too much rent, right? It's going to be very expensive. So I agree with the problem. I don't agree with the solution of rent control. I think most economists, if you survey the professors around campus here, economists, even people who identify as progressive would say rent control is not the best way to try to bring down overall housing costs. The economics just don't work out very well. So, you know, I do sort of agree with the principle that Bob is saying that local control is a good thing, but I can't vote for this just because I think rent control is a bad policy. Did you want to say, before we get to Q&A, I see Bruno's getting ready for that, just a little bit about the bond measures. So there are several bond measures, just sort of broadly about bond measures and voters voting on bonds and such.
Yeah, California law requires all California voters to approve statewide bond measures by a 50% plus one vote. So the legislature can't just pass a bond measure, you have to approve it. We have on the ballot this year $16 billion worth of bond measures. We've had $168 billion since 1986. We're paying off $83 billion, which amounts to about $6 billion per year in terms of interest and principal. Bonds are for infrastructure, roads, schools, water levees, libraries, hospitals, housing, stem cell. And the approval rate for bonds is about 90% of the time voters approve the bonds. But most are put on the ballot by the legislature. This ballot, 2 were put on the ballot by the legislature and 2 by initiative. So 1 and 2 were put on by the legislature, dealing with housing and actually both deal with housing. One is housing and the other is housing for the mentally ill. And 3 and 4 were put on by initiative, dealing with water and children's hospitals. 3 is the most controversial in my mind when I'm having trouble deciding how I'm going to vote on that. On the ones, this is the one dealing with the water bonds. It's supported by the Planning and Conservation League, a very fine environmental organization. It's opposed by the Sierra Club, another very fine environmental organization. So it's really kind of tough to decide on that one. And 3, fascinating, 3 was the California Waterfowl Association put up the most money for it, Ducks Unlimited, but also the rice industry and Western growers. Farmers are going to be benefited by that. The other one it deals with children's hospitals, put on by the children's hospitals, and that bond measure gives money to them to build and add construction for the children's hospitals.
So I'll just make one process note about this, particularly about bond measures that are put on the ballot through the citizens' initiative process as opposed to by the legislature. And the way practically it works is if you're going to be circulating a petition to put a measure on the ballot, it costs at least $1 million typically.
Two now.
2 million, right? And so, because you need to pay petition gatherers to go out there and circulate these petitions and get sufficient signatures, and they charge a lot of money. The firms that hire these people charge a lot of money for the signatures. And so it's not a cheap thing to put one of these bond measures on the ballot. How do they get paid for? They get paid for by donors who are contributing to this. Who tends to be the donors that contribute to bond measures? It's the people who are going to benefit from the bond measures. There's no conflict of interest restriction on these kinds of things. There's basically, you get to pay to play. And actually, some of these bond measures are very explicitly so, that there's a deal made by the author of the bond measure that if you contribute to this thing, I'll write your interest into the bond, right?
That's Prop 3.
Prop 3, exactly. There's a guy named Jerry Merrill who's done this a couple of times in the past. He's very effective at getting bond measures passed. People, as Bob says, tend to vote for these because they sound good, right? More water quality things, more environmental protection, more children's hospitals, all those good things, right? They sound good, and so people vote for them at a 90% rate. There is a cost to this, though. There's always a counter argument. The cost to it is when you do financing through the bond process, you pay more over the long run because you're paying interest on this loan that you're taking out. So it may say a $1.5 million or billion bond, but it's going to pay out over time at a multiple of that.
Twice, it just double it. It's always double.
You basically double it. So we're taking on a long-term obligation when we approve these bonds. And I would just caution everybody that things are pretty good financially in the state right now. We have a surplus, we have a rainy day fund, but that's because we've been in a decade of a rising stock market. And our revenues depend heavily on the highest 1% or 5% of the population of California, high income earners, of which there are substantial numbers, especially in Silicon Valley and West Los Angeles. They pay a lot of money in taxes, but they pay it in a rising economy and rising market. When their stock portfolio takes a hit, they don't pay as much income taxes to the state, and we have an immediate deficit situation. And so I think we just need to be careful about taking on more long-term obligations through bonds or other means.
And just to summarize in terms of where people stand on these bonds, just to let you know, on Prop 1, the Republican Party says vote no, the Democratic Party says vote yes, Legal and Voters says vote yes, and the LA Times says vote yes. So that's Prop 1. Prop 1 is the housing bonds. The second one deals with mental health bonds for mental health homeless. Republican Party says on Prop 2 vote yes. Democratic Party says vote yes, the League of Women Voters says vote yes, and the LA Times says vote yes. So that one's unanimous on Prop 2. Prop 3, the League of the Democrats, Republicans are not taking position on it. The League says vote no, and the LA Times says vote no. So that's Prop 3, the water bonds. Prop 4, the children's hospital bonds, the Republican Party says vote no, Democratic Party says vote yes, the League of Women Voters says vote no, and the LA Times says vote yes. So just 2 and 2 on that one, so you have to make up your own mind on those.
And I think I saw an ad where Vin Scully said vote yes on
Oh,
children's hospital, right?
okay, well,
So that may make me vote for that one, right? Okay.
so those are the 4 bond measures. And then, of course, my favorite, Alec, the daylight savings time, is my favorite one, just to let you know that one is a measure put on by the legislature, Prop 7, deals with whether we should have year-round daylight savings time, okay? And the reason it's on the ballot is because there was an initiative in 1949 that said that you couldn't have it. So the measure repeals that initiative. If this Prop 7 passes, the legislature most likely, by a 2/3 vote, it has to be a 2/3 vote, will vote to have year-round daylight savings time. But it has to go to the federal government to approve it as well. And maybe Congress might approve it, but there's a certain president who doesn't like California, so he would probably veto that measure. Now, my son attended a proposition party the other day, and the question was, if this passes, will this help plants because there'll be another extra hour of daylight savings time? Will they grow faster because there's an extra hour? The answer, of course, is no, it doesn't affect plants.
I think if we have year-round daylight savings time, get ready to wear headlamps walking to class in the morning, right? So.
Well, nobody goes to class early.
That's true. All right. So we'd like to open it up for your questions. If you have any questions, we're happy to have a conversation with you. Go ahead, Bruno.
All right, we'll now have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Stand up when you ask your question. In the interest of time, do try to keep them brief. Priority goes to students, as always.
Bryn.
Hi, thanks to both of you for talking to us about this
Still
tonight.
louder.
Thanks to both of you for talking to us about this tonight. Going back to the discussion of Proposition 6, I saw recently that the pro-Proposition 6 campaign was thinking about starting a recall campaign against the Attorney General. How likely do you think that is, and can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was announced today. Wow, you're really up to, Bryn is up to date on things. Just announced today.
That's right.
That the sponsor of Prop 6 has filed a recall petition against the Attorney General Javier Becerra because of what I think I would agree was a misleading ballot title. The courts did not agree, however. The court upheld it. There was a lawsuit against that. And it actually comes down to the question, should the Attorney General be writing these summaries? I say no. I had Javier Becerra come to my class last year at UCLA, and I asked him that question. I said, why is the Attorney General doing this? It should be the legislative analyst or some nonpartisan group that does these things. And of course, he defended the Attorney General's office doing it. But whether it's a Democrat or Republican Attorney General, in my view, they tend to skew these ballot titles.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It seems to me that this highlights the point that a lot of voters make their decision based on very limited information about the measure. They don't read it. They don't read these kinds of analyses. They don't watch the videos necessarily. They just look for, if they're going to vote on something, they look for a cue, right? Some sort of cue. And one of the leading cues is, what is that 6 or 7 word title at the top of the ballot measure, right? When you look at your ballot and you've got the short form of the ballot, you just have the title there, right? And so if the title says repeals the gas tax, that sort of creates one vision in your mind. If it says eliminates funding for filling potholes, right, that creates a different image in your mind. So that role of setting the title is actually really important. Anyone who does studies of these voter behavior and how they make decisions would say that. So it's placing a lot of power actually in the hands of that person or entity who's creating that that ballot title. The question is whether this should be done by an elected official who's a partisan person, whether Republican or Democrat, or should it be shifted to a nonpartisan entity like the Legislative Analyst's Office, who does actually the longer summary in the ballot pamphlet, which most people would say that's a pretty objective I mean, that's what they are, right? Legislative analyst is known for its even-handedness and balance. And so a lot of people would say, well, those ballot titles should be crafted by those kind of nonpartisan policy wonkish people as opposed to a partisan person.
But also, to answer your question directly, no, he won't be recalled. But there was a state senator named Josh Newman from Orange County who was recalled for voting for this measure. So local people could be recalled, but the Attorney General probably won't be recalled. It takes a lot of signatures, and I think it's just sort of a PR thing.
Yeah, we've only had one statewide official recalled. It was in 2003. It was the governor of the state of California, Gray Davis. He was replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger. That was an extraordinary event. A lot of things came together. There was, we had an electricity crisis. There was the stock market crashed. The state was in big deficit and recession all at once. And so Gray Davis was on the receiving end of a lot of bad events. And he won the 2002 governor's election with less than the majority of the vote, right? And so people immediately said he might be vulnerable to a recall, and that's what happened to him. But that's the only time in state history. So this is basically a publicity stunt. What they're trying to do is to shed light on the ballot title itself and get people to think, oh, maybe there is something going on here with this ballot title.
Hi, thank you so much. On the animal cruelty proposition, especially with the federalism issue, isn't there already a California Proposition 65 that requires products to display like a cancer warning? Can you talk about whether that has been adjudicated in the courts or has been challenged? Because it seems sort of like an overlapping federalism issue.
Yeah, Prop 65 was passed a long, I think it was 1990.
86, 80, something like that.
86, yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
And it's been subject to some lawsuits, but I don't think it's been successfully challenged.
I think that's right. Yeah, actually, in an earlier life, I worked in a law firm, and we brought challenges against Prop 6. Is
65?
65, Prop 65, yeah. Right? It's the Toxics Initiative on behalf. This is kind of like an off story, right? But we represented the wine industry, right? And so wine bottles used to have, there's foil on wine bottles, right? There's the cork and then there's the foil. And it used to be that wine bottles had lead foil on the bottle. And so under Prop 65, that was considered a toxic and a health hazard. And so they wanted the wine industry to get rid of that foil, but also to put labels on existing bottles saying that this is a hazard to your health if you drink this wine. Okay, you can imagine the wine industry didn't like that. So they came up with we came up with a compromise that at the supermarket checkout stand, there would be instructions about how you would wipe the bottle to take whatever lead residue there is as well. So that, to your point though, that applied to winemakers not only in California, but in other states or in other parts of the world that imported wine into California. So it's a gray area of law. How much can a state regulate incoming products?
Will there be lawsuits? Of course. Will they be successful? I don't know.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I had more of a general question about the considerations to take into account whenever you're making any sort of vote on ballot measures like this beyond the direct impact of the ballot measure itself. So for instance, Prop 8, you talked about the difficulty with the fact that it's on the ballot because of labor unions against these two dialysis clinics or these two dialysis companies, and then also taking into consideration how complicated it is and whether voters should be even voting on it. So are these things to consider, and what others might there be for for precedent in general, sort of beyond what the ballot itself has its own impact.
Yeah, I mean, most voters look for cues. Who is supporting and who is opposing? Now, there's some things, maybe the gas tax, you know what that's about and you can figure that out yourself. But if you're confused by a proposition, if you're not sure about it, and Prop 8 is one that's sort of kind of obscure, what you do is who's supporting, who's opposing, what are the newspapers doing? I got this is the official Democratic Party mailer, but you get these other slate mailers, and I want to caution you when you get these other slate mailers, they have paid their way to be on this. If there's an asterisk next to the proposition or the candidate, that just means they paid for it. And so it doesn't mean, this one, there's one that says cops. Well, the cops actually didn't put it out. It says this is not a police organization, it's just an organization called cops. So be careful about slate mailers. If you see one from the official Democratic Party, the official Republican Party, they have actually taken official positions on it. But voters look for cues. If they're confused, they vote no. 40% of voters vote no on everything. So that's why you always want to be on the no side.
Yeah, so just to restate that, the default position is no. And I think that's probably, there's some wisdom in that, because a lot of times embedded in initiatives, there might be something that sounds good as the headline, but then embedded in the initiative is something that's more problematic. And if you can't sort of dig down and have that level of information to know what either the hidden provision is or the unintended consequence, it's probably not a bad default position just to say no. If you actually know that you like something and you're confident you have a good sense of the measure, then it's fine to vote yes. But if you're confused, probably no is not a bad option.
Thank you for your talk. Earlier in this year, my question's about Proposition 10, and earlier in this year, I recall the Assembly putting out a bill for the repeal of Costa-Hawkins, where it immediately died in the legislature. And both of you agree that Proposition 10 is likely to fail, but do you think that its appearance on the ballot may kind of reinforce some kind of widespread Assembly Democratic motion to push the repeal through the legislature?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and the Democrats are expected to control the legislature next year, probably by a 2/3 vote in each house, but I don't think the legislature will act. First of all, they'll say the people have spoken on it, and my guess is the people are going to speak by about a 2-to-1 margin against it, maybe not that much. But secondly, there are a bunch of moderate Democrats in the legislature, and the California Real Estate Association is one of the most powerful lobbying groups in California. So in my mind, it's very, very unlikely that Costa-Hawkins will be repealed by the legislature, particularly if this initiative goes down by a huge margin, which it's likely to do.
So maybe you could share a little bit more about the existing law. So it is possible that there are some ways in which local jurisdictions can do some rent control, is that right?
Well, but it's only for buildings built before 1995.
So older buildings.
Older buildings.
And so you could see some movement to try to incrementally do a little bit more rent control, do you think?
Well, but no,
really?
the cities that have wanted to do it have done it. So I don't see any more cities doing it.
Okay, good. Any questions?
Hi, thanks so much. So you mentioned that the gas tax repeal was put on the ballot as a way to help Republican congressional candidates, and you talked about what you thought of the future of that initiative, but how much of an impact do you think it'll actually have on Republican congressional candidates, and do you think it'll be effective in doing what the real job sort of was of that initiative?
Well, the interesting thing to me is several Democratic candidates running for Congress in Orange County have said vote yes on the initiative. So they have taken, and some of the liberals in their area are very upset with the fact they're saying vote yes. I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. But the elections in Orange County, and really watch those congressional elections in Orange County, the Rohrabacher seat, the Mimi Walters is running, Young Kim, the Darrell Issa seat. There's a Steve Knight race up here in Santa Clarita. Those 5 congressional districts are neck and neck. I mean, the polls show them 48-48. So the real question is, who will turn out to vote? There's for older people like me, 70% of us are saying we really want to get out and vote. For younger people like you, 35% say they want to get out and vote. And Latinos are about 50%. And I understand Latinos in one district are saying, well, Donald Trump's not on the ballot, so why should we vote? So the real question is, next Tuesday, and all across the country, but also in Orange County, what's the turnout? Turnout, turnout, turnout. If it's a high turnout, and so far the interest is very high, apparently across the country 8 million absentee ballots have been cast as compared to 2 million 4 years ago. So there's a tremendous interest in voting. But the real question is, will young people come out and vote, and will people of color come out and vote?
Yeah, I would just say I understand the logic why congressional Republicans thought this was helpful, just largely because for conservatives or Republicans in California, there's not much to get excited about on the ballot, right? And so you could imagine that this would have caught people's interest a little bit more and gained a little bit more traction. And so there was a logic to it. It just doesn't seem, partly because of a lack of spending, a pretty big no campaign that's been pretty effective, the way the ballot measure was drafted. It just hasn't gotten the traction that it might have gotten. But if it weren't on the ballot, there might be even less motivation for Republicans to get out.
We still have time for questions. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I am wondering about the origin of the cost of repairing the roads, and as related to the weather in California versus Pennsylvania, or if you can share with us some data about miles per mile road that exists in California that indicates that we are so much more using our road than other states. Thank you.
Yeah, we have thousands and thousands of miles of roads, and they're talking about in the ad, and I can't verify this, they're saying there are 200 bridges just in LA County that need to be repaired. They're dangerous right now, and this money will be used for that. We have $100 billion worth of road infrastructure that needs to be done. And this measure deals with $4 to $5 billion a year. So we've deferred maintenance on our roads, our hospitals, other buildings for a long time, and this will go a long ways to repairing what should have been repaired a long time ago.
Yeah, so I would agree that we have a huge infrastructure problem of deferred maintenance, and it's bad, and it's been going on for a long time. And the question is, how should it be funded, it seems to me. One of the things that the proponents of Prop 6 have come out and said is what we want to do in the future, maybe what we should have done this time around, is to say that gas tax money should be dedicated, committed, earmarked for road repair and not to other projects, right? So that would be sort of an attractive proposition for people that are saying, okay, if I'm paying for a gas tax, I know that it's going to be going to fixing potholes and roads and bridges. It's not necessarily going to be going to other purposes, which is currently, at least some of it does.
Well, actually, Prop 69 was passed in June of this year, which the legislature put on the ballot, and said that all gas tax money has to be used for roads and mass transit, not the bullet train, by the way. They said not the bullet train, but for mass transportation, the light rail, and fixing the road. So it cannot be used. In the past, money was used because we had a huge deficit, if you remember, several years ago. Gas tax money was actually used to pay down the deficit, to pay off the deficit. In the future, that can't happen. Even if we have a major recession, gas tax money will have to be used for roads and transportation.
Do you know how much of currently the gas tax is used to subsidize public transit, light rail, all that kind of thing?
As I understand, it's about 20 to 25%.
Okay.
Of course, when you use mass transit, that means less use of the road. So that's.
Thank you for your talk. I was just wondering, so like a lot of people have referred to this election as like the blue wave, and I'm wondering if there's any like correlation that you guys know about the propositions being more liberal and that kind of push. And I guess you kind of talked about it a little bit with the encouraging Republicans to come out to vote, but maybe more generally about like the types of propositions that get put on the ballot in these types of years.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I would just, to give a little bit of historical context, if we were having this session, say, in the 1990s, the mix of ballot measures would look really different than they do today. The California ballot would frequently have very conservative ballot measures. Some would include things like Proposition 209, which banned affirmative action in California, or Proposition 184, which created the 3 strikes and you're out sentencing law, or Proposition 187, which placed restrictions on benefits for undocumented immigrants. And that was very characteristic of California at a time when the state was in transition. It wasn't fully a progressive state at that time. You're not seeing those kinds of ballot measures on our ballot anymore. And in fact, some of the most important recent measures have been things that have raised taxes. Proposition 30 raised taxes, especially on high-income earners. So that's a change. We used to use the initiative process to reduce taxes and cut them, and now we're using it to raise it or to preserve tax increases, such as the gas tax. I mean, it was put on the ballot by conservatives. I think 20 years ago it would have passed pretty easily, but today, likely not, right? I don't think so.
It's because we're a democratic state, and
Right.
so they take a look. Now, I guess the last major conservative initiative might have been the ban on gay marriage, 2008.
Yeah, so that was 2008, so about a decade ago, and there hasn't been sort of a major conservative ballot measure since then.
Although actually Prop 5 on the ballot this time is a major conservative measure. We haven't talked about it at all. That's a measure that helps me tremendously because it allows me to sell my house and take my existing low property taxes and apply it to another house that's much more expensive, and I will save thousands and thousands of dollars. So, of course, all the elderly like me will be voting for it. I'm not actually voting for it, but it's going to cost the state up to $2 billion because it's going to keep property taxes very low for rich people who own houses and want to buy other houses. So that's actually a measure that we haven't talked about, but actually is a conservative measure.
It's a legacy of Proposition 13. Some of you know that Prop 13 was passed in 1978, placed a pretty serious cap on property taxes in the state. It was the beginning of the taxpayers' revolt of the 70s and 80s, and it remains in place today. It's part of, it suggests that there is at least some a conservative-ish remnant in the state because it's considered something that is dangerous politically to try to repeal Prop 13 or promote a repeal of Prop 13. There will be a measure on the 2020 ballot that will change Prop 13 to make it not apply to commercial properties anymore. But it'll be interesting to see.
But I
whether
think
that one
Prop
passes.
5 is going to pass because there's no money being spent against it. And people like me say, oh, great.
Yeah.
Homeowners are going to think it's
It'll
great.
gin up the turnout of
That's right.
the senior set. Yeah. Okay.
You don't need to do that.
This will probably have to be the last question of the night, if there is one.
There we go.
In the beginning, you mentioned something we wouldn't be voting on. So what do you think are the long-term prospects of breaking up California into multiple states?
So what?
Breaking up California into multiple states?
Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to happen because the court has said first of all, the legislature won't put it on the ballot, and the court has said you can't do it by initiative. So I think it'd be a great thing to talk about. I like the idea of bringing the state capitals closer to the people. I've visited all 50 state capitals. It was give me 2 more state capitals I could have visited if this thing passed. But first of all, California voters probably wouldn't approve it. Then second, the Senate and the House would have to approve it. They wouldn't want to approve it. So it's very unlikely we're going to see it, but it was an interesting idea. Unfortunately, we're not going to be voting on it.
Yeah, it's another one of these ideas, sort of like the daylight savings time, where California can't do it unilaterally. I mean, you would need to have congressional approval, and it's one of those things where there would actually be a partisan split on this, because it would increase the number of U.S. senators and therefore electoral votes for California, and so other states would not necessarily like that, especially red states who would see this as being sort of multiplying Democratic votes nationally. So.
Awesome. Please join me in thanking our speakers for tonight.
Thank you.